Good morning. Glad to see everyone here today. I don't know if you can hear that. Is this on? Can you hear that in the back, maybe? Hopefully. But if not, I can speak up a little bit louder. My wife says I'm plenty loud. If you can't hear, just do this, and I'll know I need to speak up a little bit. But I'm happy to be here with everyone today. I appreciate the kind words from Brandon on his behalf. And yes, he kind of helped, or we all kind of helped each other stay sane, I guess, while we were at school in Memphis. And yes, I do have a little more hair now, but you know, the fact of the matter is, that was only 2 years of my life. As far as since I've been an adult, I didn't have some form of a beard. So he didn't know me from where I normally look prior to coming up there. And besides gaining that, unfortunately, I've done the exact opposite, and I've gained a little weight since I've left Memphis too. So anyway, enough with that. But I am happy to have the invitation. So happy to see every one of you that are gathered here today. And I know you're looking forward to VBS. It's one of the most fun times that we have back home as well. And everybody always enjoys it. And I believe our older people enjoy it, or the adults enjoy it almost as much as the young people do. And I hope you feel that way too. But today I wanted to talk to us this morning a little bit about the importance of education. And if you were to think about it, how important is education? On a scale of 1 to 10, just how highly would you rate an education? Well, I hear some mumbling, but I hear some 10s. And I would almost agree with you, but except I would go beyond that and say I would say it would be an 11. I would go beyond the scale. Education is the absolute most importance. And I'm talking about in all facets or all aspects of life. If you've got your Bibles with you, open up to Proverbs chapter 2 this morning. And I want us to notice before we begin, just these 5 verses and what Solomon, who is arguably the wisest man who ever lived, had to say in regards to this matter of seeking wisdom or seeking knowledge. He said, "My son, if thou wilt receive my words and hide my commandments with thee, so that thou incline thine ear unto wisdom and apply thine heart to understanding, yea, if thou criest," notice here he says, "after knowledge, and liftest up thy voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as for hid treasures, then shalt thou understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God." Is there anyone in here who doesn't put very much value on money? I don't see any hands, but you know, well, I bet you don't get your food or anything for free, probably though, do you? But the point is, there is value to that, and we spend our lives working in order to earn money or things so that we might be able to provide for our families, don't we? Yes, absolutely we do, and that's commendable. That's what a Christian should do. But the fact of the matter is also true that as Christians, having knowledge and understanding is also of the utmost importance. And the way that we do that is through education. And so when you think about education, it can be defined in a couple of different ways. If you just look it up in the dictionary, you'll notice there it says it's the process of receiving systematic instruction, especially at a school or university. Brandon's already mentioned the fact that we went to Memphis for a couple of years, and I'll come back to that again a little bit later on, hopefully at the end of the class if we have enough time. But you know, the idea of going and receiving instruction in any facet of our life is important, isn't it? It doesn't necessarily matter if it's a school like that where you're going to learn the Bible, or if you're talking about vocational schools or a college to earn a degree in anything. We pursue that so that we might be what? Successful. We want to be successful in life, and we teach that and we stress that to our children. But an education can also be an enlightening experience. By that, I'll just give you a real easy example. How many of you have ever babysat, or do you remember the first time you kept a child by yourself? It was an enlightening experience, wasn't it? Yeah, absolutely it was. And so you learn something through that. And, you know, while that's a little bit of a joke, I guess it might say, that's real world experience. But that's also a form of education in this life. And so I don't know, you know, or I know there are various ways we might look at it, but as we said, the point or the purpose of receiving an education is that we might gain knowledge, and so that we might have understanding in this life. And hopefully, with a proper education, we will be able to make good and appropriate choices in this life. And that, as I'm saying that, I'm talking about whether it's in our secular work life or whether it's in our spiritual life as Christians. The same type of thing should apply to it. And so, you know, when we stop and think, the fact that an education must also consist of more than just the facts or just the theories. There has to be a practical application of the knowledge in which we attain. And that is oftentimes referred to as wisdom, but it's also experience in this life. You know, the idea of having a practical understanding of something, how important is that? It's very important. I'll give you a quick example. Through school, I loved math, okay? I loved geometry. I understood that. Circumferences, shapes, volumes, you know, distances, all those things, it made perfect sense. I understood why I needed that in my life, and so why I needed to understand that. But fast forward another year or two later, and I take Algebra 2 and trigonometry. I understood the formulas and the principles and how to do the problems, but nobody ever told me what it was going to be good for in my life. Do you think I remember how to do any of that? No, I see a couple of people shaking their head. No, I don't, because I was never given a reason why it should be important. Now, granted, I'm sure there are. If there weren't, nobody would do it, but nobody taught me that. And so I disregarded that. Now, I'm not saying I couldn't learn it again, but I see no point in it. Over 30 years since then, I've not used it to my knowledge. And I may be lacking in some area, but I don't feel as though that I am. But the point being, if there is going to be something that we're going to invest our time in learning and understanding, we need to see the importance or the reasoning behind why we should invest our time in doing that. I want to ask this question. What do you suppose helped make people like Paul and Apollos and Timothy to be such good evangelists and such good teachers throughout their career? What was the fundamental thing they had? Well, I'll just go ahead and share with you. It was knowledge. Paul, he talked about the fact that he was raised at the feet of Gamaliel. He was a known doctor of the law who had a good reputation among the people. Well, I thought I had that slide up there in regards to that. That's Acts 5:23 talks about that. You can go back and double check me if I'm not mistaken. But Gamaliel was an expert in the law, and he was the one that taught Paul initially all the things he knew about the Old Testament scriptures and God's law. You think the same thing about Apollos? We don't know his background, but we know that it says that he was mighty in the scriptures. Friends, that means he knew what the scripture said. He knew what God's word was. And Timothy was the same thing. It said from a child, he had been taught the Holy Scriptures, and that's the reason why the faith, Paul bragged about the faith in which he had, but that came from the instruction of his mother and his grandmother. And so we have here reasons why these men were very, successful, or part of the reason why they were very successful when they went out to preach and they went out to evangelize, because they knew what they were talking about. And that makes a huge difference in the world. If you're going to talk to someone about the Lord and they ask you a question and you go, you can ask my preacher or you can ask my elder, that's not going to help you to be very successful, is it? No. Now, I'm not saying you have to know the answer to every question that's out there. That's not what I mean. But there is a practical sense of the knowledge of God's word that we all, as Christians, should be able to carry with us. And if we don't have to have it all memorized, we can know where it's at, though, in the book, and we can take them to that. As a matter of fact, I say that's the best, because they can then look for themselves and see what God has to say in regards to any subject or any matter. So these men were educated. They were prepared. Now, I want to share with you just very briefly an article. I'm going to read through it pretty quick because there are only really 3 points. I don't know a lot about the man who had written the article himself, but this is what he had to say. And I think it applies for us spiritually as well as any other aspect of our life. He said, education is an important issue in one's life. He said, it is the key to success in the future and to have many opportunities in our life. Education has many advantages for people. He says, for instance, it illuminates a person's mind and thinking. It helps students plan for work or pursue higher education. Having education in an area helps people think, feel, and behave in a way that contributes to their success and improves not only their personal satisfaction, but also their community. So that in addition, education develops human personality, thoughts, and prepares people for life experiences. And it makes people have a special status in their own society, and where or everywhere that they live. And so he says that education helps provide 3 things. Here we go. A good career, a good status in our society, and also self-confidence. Now, I want us to consider that from both the worldly and also the spiritual or the Christian perspective, these three different benefits. And so I want to begin with a good career. You know, a good education, though, is it always a guarantee of success? No, no, it is not. There are many people who have went through college and have never been able to put their degree to use. Many people have graduated high school and learned things and never applied much of that in which they learned. Yet there are very few professions out in the world today that do not require an education of some sort, are there? And I don't care if you're talking about from the guy that's digging a ditch to the person who's a neurosurgeon. Everyone has to have some degree of education. And I know that may sound like a joke for those of you who've never spent time digging in a ditch before, and I have. Okay, I used to pour concrete back years ago doing construction work. And so you have to have at least some knowledge of what you're digging and why. Now, it doesn't seem like much, but it is important, believe it or not. And so the fact of the matter is, all people need to have some understanding. And while it may not seem like a whole lot, it's going to be a whole lot better, and you're going to have more confidence in a person who does know what they're talking about. You stop and think about it. Would you want to go have someone perform surgery on you who's not been through medical school? No, I wouldn't either. You know, I remember back years ago, and I forget when it was exactly, but I read an article, and it was talking about primitive brain surgery. They'd found this, an archaeologist, and they showed a picture of a skull with a hole bored in it. And I thought, I bet you that didn't work out too well for the person that they did that on way back, however long ago that was. Just because you find a hole in someone's head, I figure they probably just killed them. And then they wanted to say that it was brain surgery. But whatever, you know, people have their ideas and their reasons for the things in which they do. But all silliness aside, though, one's education is important in regards to making one capable of meeting standards and meeting the requirements that are necessary to achieve success in anything in this life. It'll help polish the mind, it'll reinforce and strengthen our thoughts, and it prepares us for whatever endeavor we choose to undertake. And of course, truth be told, the more a person is educated in anything, the more experience they gain, the better their odds of success. And being a successful Christian is no different. Because, friends, in order to become a Christian, first things first, I must be taught. I must understand something about Christianity. No one has ever woken up anywhere on this planet at any time and without information woken up and said, you know what, I think I'm going to become a Christian. It's never happened. It never will happen. Because that's not the way that God has designed the system nor set it up. We have a responsibility of ourselves to be able to do that. And so the first thing, if one wants to become a Christian, they have to, what type of knowledge, what information do they need to receive? Well, first they need to hear about Jesus, don't they? What he did, why he did it, what was the purpose for it, and what that means to me, right? If someone asks you, why did Jesus come? What would your answer be? Not trying to put anybody on the spot. Don't look at me like my people do back home, like I'm setting them up here. That's not what I'm doing. He came to seek and save the lost, right? I mean, that's just a simple answer. He came and he died on the cross, shed his blood, so that we might have forgiveness of sins. And so that message has to be carried out, and people have to learn that. And of course, there are lots of other things that you can tell them about that. But the fact of the matter is, we have to be taught. Now, you think about Paul and Silas when they were in jail in Philippi after they'd been beaten and put in there. And of course, they're singing songs. And I still can't fathom the man that's just been beaten, he and his friend, and being able to sit in there and sing songs and be rejoicing in the Lord over this. When I was growing up and my dad whipped me, I was mad for hours. So I don't know that I'd have been able to do that. And what they received was much, much worse than anything I ever did as a child. But you think about it, after that earthquake and the jailer thought that everyone had left, and obviously he had heard not only the singing, but perhaps Paul and Silas had already been mentioning things to them concerning the Lord, because his question, what must I do to be saved? And so something had prompted that. And so then they went on then and taught him what must be done, and he and his family were eventually saved. They were baptized into Christ. But friends, let's stop and think about this for a moment. When we think about what it takes to become a Christian, How difficult is that to teach? How many kids know a song that you can use as hand? Hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized, and live faithfully, right? It's pretty easy. It's pretty simple to teach. What's more difficult about the Christian life? Learning how to become a Christian or learning how to faithfully live as that Christian? Learning how to faithfully live as that Christian. Because when you think about it as far as the amount of material that's written in the New Testament, very little is written in regards to what it takes to become a Christian. And the rest, or the overwhelming majority, is telling us how we ought to live on a daily basis and how we ought to treat other people. And so it's very important, very important. If it wasn't, God wouldn't have included it in His Word. Now, I'm not trying to say or diminish the importance of becoming a Christian. Please don't misunderstand me. But it's something that we can teach anyone very simply. And it's something that can be understood very simply. The fact of learning how to live with other people, especially in regards to human relationships, that's hard, isn't it? Anybody in here never been in an argument with their spouse or their child or a friend? Brandon, don't even think to raise your hand. I'm just kidding. But no, we all have. But it's how we resolve those situations that God is instructing us and teaching us what to do in here. But we have to be educated. We have to learn, because our natural inclination is oftentimes to do what? If you do something to make me mad, guess what? I'm going to pay you back, right? That's the antithesis. That's the opposite of what a Christian ought to do. Am I right? Yeah. And so there are many other things like that that we look at in this life that we have to learn, or that we have to be taught. We have to know what the difference is. And so, you know, when we think about this as far as being educated, it's of the utmost importance in being a Christian as well as anything in which we might pursue in this life, if we're going to have or put forth an effort to try to be successful. And friends, if we're going to be Christians, we need to be successful Christians, we need to be faithful Christians. That brings me then to the second point that the author mentioned. He says that a good education will give someone a good status in society. Now, I'm not going to agree with him totally in regards to this. I can only take this premise to a limited extent. And be honest with you, I would strongly disagree in several situations, because, you know, if you read this whole article, which I only gave you all just a little brief excerpt or snippet from it, the author just simply equates having an education with making good moral and ethical decisions. Is that correct? No, we know it's not. You can look around the world today, and now we're not going to start chasing rabbits, but you stop and you think about just some of the things that are being foisted upon us in society, whether it's through education or our government. Are they good or are they evil? Well, friends, there's a lot of evil being proliferated in this world today and being forced upon us and being forced upon our children. And that's why I say, just because someone receives an education doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to make good moral and good ethical choices. That's why some people think it's okay to steal. Some people think it's okay to have affairs or commit adultery on their spouse. Some people even think that if the situation is correct, it's okay to kill someone. And believe that's true, depending on where they are in the world. And that's why when you stop and think about having a good status in society, it depends upon what you look at as your standard of judgment, as far as your standard of basis for what is morally or ethically right. It either comes from a standard in which man has incorporated in this world, or it comes from a standard in which God has incorporated in this world. And friends, one is greater than the other. And I think we all know which one is the greatest, and that's the standard which comes from God. Because here's the thing, when man sets a moral standard, does it always stay the same? No, it changes according to time and according to geography oftentimes. If you just stop and you think about things that are ethically accepted or morally accepted today, you can go back 20, 30, 40 years ago and people would pass out if they saw some of the things that are being passed or put forth as being acceptable in society today. And that's because man lives by what is oftentimes described, or I'd say often, but sometimes described as situation ethics. And so they look at the context of this person. Well, How did they grow up? What were they taught? And what kind of environment were they raised? And that's how they determine whether a thing is right or not. Is that how God makes his determination for what's morally right or wrong? No, no. The same instruction we find in here is for everyone. It was written how long ago? Rough number. Roughly 2,000 years ago on the other side of the world. But it still applies for us today, living in a much more modern society. But what's not changed? People. People are still the same. They still do the same things that we read about in the Old Testament. We talk about the evils in our society today. Friends, they were happening long before we were ever even a glimmer in our parents' eyes or their parents, and I don't care how many generations you go back. You read through the Old Testament again and just sit down and make a list of all the evil that you find was taking place back then. And it will blow your mind if you're not familiar with it. It makes our society sometimes look like it's not so bad. And truth be told, it really is. And so the fact of the matter is, just because one has an education does not guarantee that they will have a good status in society. But on the opposite of that, I will say a good Christian education will enable someone to make good and have a good status in society. The reason I state this is just because a person learns what it means to become a Christian. We've already talked about that a little bit. And even if they go through the outward formalities, it in no way guarantees that they are going to live as a Christian in this life. It was Jesus who told his disciples, recorded in John, he says, if you love me, he says, you are going to keep my commandments. If you go back to the original language, that's what he's stressing here, saying you will keep my commandments. Okay? And of course, he goes on and extrapolates on that a little bit more in that text. But, Jesus also teaches us, though, something important, because his commandments are given for a purpose, as we've already said, in teaching us how we ought to live in this life. And if you go back and you think about what he had written on the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about the fact that we are supposed to be the salt of the earth. Anybody in here like salt on their food? I doubt anybody likes it as much as my wife. She beats all I've ever seen. She cooks and she adds a little salt and then she'll get it out and get it on her plate and she'll just keep putting the salt on it. I'm like, wow, I don't know how you do it. I don't even like to cook with salt too much, but it's good. It's good seasoning. But Jesus says if a person has lost his flavor, his savor, his taste, he's no longer good for nothing. If you like salt and it doesn't taste like salt, are you going to keep putting it on your food? No. You're going to throw it away and you're going to go and look for something different, or you're going to go and buy some more. And spiritually speaking, that's the application here. He's talking about the fact that if you are not living in such a way that puts forth something good, something beneficial in regards to being a Christian, you're not worth anything. You're of no value. And friends, we lose that. Getting a little bit ahead of some of my stuff here, but we lose our flavor when we don't live as Christians. He went on to say in that same context that we're supposed to be a light in this world. We understand that. In other words, we're supposed to be something visible. We're not supposed to be hidden. And the reason being is so that when people see the way we live our lives, the way we treat other people, the way we handle situations in which we encounter, and we do it differently, perhaps, than some other people or what's common, that's not going to be something about, Derek, he's just such a great guy. No, I'm not. I'm not saying I'm a bad guy. But the reason I behave the way I behave is because I am trying to live according to the way in which God has instructed me to do. And so therefore, it's not me that gets any credit, because these are not ideas that are original with me, and they're not things that are always easy for me to do, but it's God that gets the credit. And that's what we need to stress to people. We need to stress to people in that regard. And so we have to learn the things that we're supposed to be doing. We have to learn the things that we're not supposed to be doing. And so the fact of the matter is, we have to be educated. I'll get this clicker working here in a minute. But anyway, the point there, we do that through education. And I'm talking about educated through the scriptures here. Third thing I want to mention this morning is the fact that, and going along with this slide there, is that it will produce, or a good education will produce self-confidence. And I think that's almost universally true. You know, one thing that causes a lack of confidence, perhaps more than anything else, is when we're unsure concerning something, when we have doubts. And if we don't have a good spiritual education, a good scriptural education, then it's going to cause us those doubts. But even in all aspects of life, if you think about it, having confidence, it helps us manage specific tasks or things that we are required to do for our jobs. And in the same way, it helps us to tackle life's challenges, the difficulties that we face, and it helps us to maintain or to make positive stands in this life. Now, you know, perhaps there's no better example in the scriptures, and we started out by looking at some of his writings in Proverbs chapter 2 of a person who recognized the fact that they needed knowledge if they were going to be able to do these things, and that's Solomon himself. Now, if you go back and you think about it, when he became a king, what was the land like in Israel at that point in time? It was rough. Let's be honest. There was basically a split in his family over who wanted to be king to begin with. And so there was that feud. And then all the things, as great of a person as David was in many regards, he had a lot of faults. And he left behind a lot of baggage for his son to have to clean up and to take care of. Talk about enemies that were there, the rivalries between those who were supposed to be family members due to the fact that he had had children through so many different wives. And so he was in a bad situation, and he was a young man. He was a young man, but he was trying to serve the Lord. He was trying to be faithful. And when God asked him what he wanted, well, I thought I put that verse in there, but evidently I didn't. But it's 1 Kings 3:9. And God asked him, he said, I will give you whatever you ask me, Solomon. I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but he asked for what? He said, an understanding heart, knowledge, wisdom, to know how to be able to rule over his people effectively, because he had been put in charge of a nation, and not just any nation. This was a nation in which God had created for a purpose. And that purpose, of course, was to eventually bring the Messiah into the world. And so he had arguably one of the most difficult jobs that a person could have at that point in time. And so he understood the fact that he needed that if he was going to be able to successfully do those very things in which we just talked about. You know, friends, education, as we said, is a process of acquiring knowledge and information to lead us to a successful future. It's true in our secular lives, and it's especially true in our spiritual lives. And so, do you think that we can place too great of an importance on education, spiritually speaking? Anyone here? No, you cannot. I mean, why are you having VBS? It's not just to have fun, is it? It's to teach children, right? To help reaffirm the idea of the value of knowing and understanding who God is, and the fact that it should be important to them. You know, we read just the first 5 verses of Proverbs chapter 2. I'm not going to go through all of it this morning, but I would encourage all of you to go back and read through the whole context of that, because Solomon in that chapter, he basically describes to an extent or to a degree what we've been talking about this morning. Yes, you need to have a strong desire to pursue that education, but then he goes on and begins to explain why. It's to avoid the pitfalls and the traps that are out there in this life, to be able to forsake it, recognize and forsake evil, and to be able to cling to that which is good, which is God. That's the point of that chapter. And I would encourage us to read that regularly and to think about that, especially those of us that have children and have grandchildren, because they're coming up in a world that is growing increasingly difficult to live in, morally speaking. It's never been easy. Don't misunderstand. There have always been bad influences, but friends, they're much more prevalent today than what they have been in society, or at least since I've been alive anyway. And so when we begin to think about that and the importance of it, I know that we look at what we do here as a church, and I say what we do here, you understand what I'm saying, what you guys do here, what we do back home at our congregation, and we spend time and we put effort into the idea of teaching our children. But let's be honest, and let's look at it from a perspective here. How much time do you think a child spends just in a week if they're here on Sunday mornings for Bible class and they're here on Wednesday evenings for Bible class, how much time do they get a week in Bible education in that regard? Roughly an hour, give or take, a little over an hour a week. And so if you think about it from the age of 2, when they began to really be able to, start to be taught a little bit of something until they graduate at 18, that's about 16 years. If you're faithful and you have them here every time, and I'm talking about just for that instruction. And over the course of 16 years, that works out to be a little over 800 hours, give or take. And so if it's a little more than an hour, we can round it up and we can say 1,000 hours. If you think about just 1,000 hours by itself, that sounds like an impressive number, right? But over 16 years, it's not really. It's not really when you think about it. Brandon mentioned Memphis earlier. When we were in Memphis, you went to school or you were in class for 6 hours a day. And then you were supposed to, if you were really doing what was right, spend 6 hours at home studying. And I know that I was pretty faithful in that. I know Brandon was pretty faithful in that. I have another friend, I know he was, because we were always studying. As a matter of fact, we studied together a lot. Now, you had times when you had to write papers and things and you didn't want them to be around or they didn't want us to be around because it was a distraction. But friends, it spent a lot of time. Okay. All right. I thought somebody was raising something up and it was squeaky back there, but that's the buzzer. All right. Anyway, got distracted there for a moment. But anyway, here's the point I'm trying to make. 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, that's 60 hours. Now, I'm not going to count the time that we spend on weekends preparing to go preach and the time we spend in class. I'm going to totally disregard that. But if you stop and think about 2 years that we spent there in Memphis, the amount of time, and I've got it written down here. I've got to double check just to make sure that I'm right, and I'm not going to tell you a fib. But take off a couple of weeks that we were out of school. So if you put that down to about 48 weeks a year or 49 weeks a year for 2 years, 60 hours a week, that's 5,880 hours of instruction in 2 years' time. It was every bit of that. And that was covering the Bible. That was covering aspects of history. You think about the intertestament period, geography, talking about lots of other different things there. It took us a long time to go through that, and that was a very methodical study or very methodical curriculum. So let me ask you, in comparison, when we think about what we're educating our young people when we come together for church, do we think, or come together for classes when we meet as a church, do we think that we're doing enough? It's my only point. I'm not trying to knock what we're doing because what we're doing is important. Believe me, it is. But I'm speaking to us as parents and grandparents at home. We've got to reinforce those ideals continually. If you go back to Deuteronomy 6 and you think about what Moses said, he told them, he said, you speak my law concerning my law to your children. Talked about it daily. He says, you write them on your doorpost, you bind them for a sign on your hands. He says, you wear my laws frontless before your eyes. In other words, always be thinking about it. He said, you talk about it before you lay down at night. You talk about it when you wake up. You talk about it when you're walking on your way. Talk about through daily activity. And friends, we've got to, because this world, we're sending our children to school roughly 30 to 35 hours a week. I know some of you may homeschool, but those of us who have children in public schools, 30 to 35 hours a week, they're receiving instruction, and not all of it is according to what we would have them to learn or be taught. And so we've got to counterbalance that, and we've got to teach them the fundamental things that are important. We've got to educate them according to God's word so that they can grow up and they can be ready and prepared to handle the situations they're going to find themselves in, and so that they might be successful in life as a Christian, because ultimately to be successful in life as a Christian means that we're going to end up where? In heaven. In heaven. That's our ultimate goal. That's what we desire or should desire above anything and everything else. And so it's what I wanted to talk to us a little bit about this morning. We want our children to be the type of people that Peter talked about, who are able to sanctify the Lord God, to set him apart in their heart, to keep him in a place or a position of relevance or ultimate relevance in our lives. Not let him just get jumbled up with all the other things, the social media and everything else that we want to be entertained with in life, but set God apart, put him on a pedestal, so to speak. And then also to be able to give an answer for the reason, for the hope that is in us, that we're going to make it to heaven one day. Because if we don't do that, friends, I'm afraid that those of us who are parents, who are teachers, preachers, elders, deacons, all of us are going to have to answer to the Lord one day and let him know why we didn't think it was important to do so. But I look around at this crowd today and see how many of you came in so early and smiles on your face and happy to be here. I know y'all are concerned about this and you care about this and you want people to make it to heaven. And so I just want to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. And if you can find ways to do it better, even do more, be encouraged to do so. Anyone have any thoughts or questions or comments as we're about to wind up or finish up class this morning?
God said, my people are destroyed for what reason?
For a lack of knowledge. For a lack of knowledge. And it happened over and over and over again, and ultimately for good. AD 70. Anybody else? Well, according to the clock, if it's right, we've got about a minute or less than a minute, and I see a few folks are coming in, so I'll go ahead and I'll stop right here for now. But thank you for your time, your attendance, and your participation this morning in class.